Hi guys, welcome to today's recording. We are going to sum up everything in this particular topic, focusing on variation. So this is where everything comes together. Everything that we've done so far, DNA, genes, alleles, mitosis, meiosis, test cross, Punnett squares, pedigree charts, everything comes down to this last particular section, which is looking at genetic variation. Now, genetic variation is something that we need to be able to understand, like all the things I mentioned before. We have to understand those to understand what genetic variation is and why that is important. Okay, so what is variation? So if you think about variation just means, like the things I highlighted, it just means differences between individuals within the species. Okay, so you're not comparing like a dog versus a cat because they're not the same species. You're comparing your dog versus your neighbor's dog versus your parents, your cousin's dogs, I don't know. And then you're looking at them and they will be different, okay? Because we, especially animals, most of the animals that are produced sexually, we are genetically different. Similar, we're very similar, but we are different, okay? And it is important to have variation, and we are going to essentially look at the big question here: what causes variation and what are the advantages of having genetic variation? Okay, so let's get started. Now, I typed in this because this paragraph is really important. So if you're someone from my class, can you please chuck this into your book, please, and just highlight it, because this is an extremely popular question every year in exams. Okay, so mutation is a permanent change in the base sequence that creates a new allele. So that means you make new proteins, which means you will have a new physical trait. So a few things that we, this is linking some of the exam questions. If you start going through them next week onwards, you will start to see that they love to ask about new mutations and the relationship between genes and alleles and DNA and everything together. So just a quick recap. So remember that a DNA, a double helix structure, this is a DNA, so this contains all of your genetic information. A section of the DNA, like a small section, is a gene. Okay, so a gene codes for one characteristic, and then you have different versions of the characteristic. So let's just do it here. Then different versions of the same gene. Okay, so they could be coding, so there are different alternative versions that code for the same gene. So different versions, which are the alleles, and alleles you get one from mom, one from dad, so one from each parent, which then determines your genotype. Now your genotype then determines your phenotype. What is genotype? Genotype which is essentially the combination of your alleles. The capital A, small a, capital A, capital A, small a, small a, the things that we talked about before. That's your genotype. That's what you inherited from your parents. And then the phenotype is what we can physically see. Okay, so this is phenotype, physical. So this is the physical trait that we observe. Okay, so this is something they always link mutation to. They go, mutation happens, blah blah blah. This is a mutation in this particular animal, but they have this particular trait. Describe what mutation is. Link your answers to DNA, genes, alleles, blah blah blah, and how that increases variation. That's what a typical NCEA level 1 question looks like. I mean, I've been marking exams for quite a few years, and that's the same questions every single year. So with the mutation, you just need to understand is that, yep, I have a normal gene here, and then what happens, and genes are made of the base pairing. So let's just break it down a little bit more. So if you look at inside the gene, you have the A, T, C, G, the base pairing stuff. Yeah, so that determines what proteins gets produced. So what mutation does is that it changes the sequence. Okay, so it, like say, if it was A, T, C, G, and then C, G, T, A, for example. There are so many different types of mutation. If you do level 2 biology, you'll know there's insertion, deletion, there's all sorts of crazy stuff, and because it's not a perfect system, mistakes happen. Like sometimes you can just have the entire thing deleted, sometimes you can have like another section being added in. That's what mutations do, and it's due to the environment, mostly due to radioactivity. Like if you're someone that lives in Chernobyl, you know, definitely most likely gonna experience some mutation that's most likely going to be very harmful. So in the base sequence, when the mutation occurs, it changes. When the mutation, the base sequence is changed. So when the base sequence is changed, you will no longer have the original allele, because you will end up having a new different version. You created a different version of the same gene. So and that means you make a new protein, because the protein determines what we look like, and then you create a physical trait, and that will stand out. And that's how we know we had a mutation. Like say, for example, plants, animals, etc., etc. How do we know we had a mutation? Because we can see it. Okay, like say something really that's currently related, like so for example the COVID virus. The virus is known to mutate every single year. That's why there's so many variants, variation. There's so many variants because they mutate. And how do they mutate? It's completely random. Okay, some are more deadly, some are less deadly, and that's why we get the flu jab every year. Okay, so why do we need the flu jab? Because the flu virus evolves, well, not I want to say evolve, they mutate every year, so they change a little bit, and you have to get a new jab every year just to cope with the new variation. Okay, so because of the chance of mutation just naturally occurring, and that's why that's a big cause of variation within the species. Now, think about evolution over hundreds of thousands of years. You may have a population of a particular type of animal just living happily, and then suddenly there's a mutation in one of the individuals. Not like drastic turn to Spider-Man, that sort of thing, but then just maybe a small change in the system, a small change in the physical trait, and that particular trait might turn out to be beneficial. Okay, if it turns out to be beneficial, then it starts to it will live longer, it's going to get more food, it's going to be able to reproduce more, and then slowly over time that favorable trait will be passed on to the through generations, and then maybe if you come back and visit that particular group of animals after 50 years, you're going to see that particular mutated trait going to be more common because it's beneficial. Now, if the trait that has been, if the thing goes through mutation and then it ends up with an unfavorable trait, so something that makes it stand out, like say just particular example, I think albino animals could be a result of mutation. I'm not too sure on that, but then think about, like say, if you're a rat, for example, and then you're white furred, you're going to stand out a lot more, and then you're going to get eaten a lot quicker, then you won't be able to reproduce, and then you won't see any of those rats around. Okay, just as an example. So this is one of the natural way of mutation, genetic variation. This is how you can create variation. Number one, through mutation. Naturally occurring, random, completely random. You could end up with favorable trait, you could end up with unfavorable trait, you could end up with trait that makes absolutely no difference whatsoever in their everyday life, but that would create variation, which is again differences in the genotype, in the phenotype of the individuals within the population. All right, so this is number one. The number two, the second one, is sexual reproduction. Okay, so sexual reproduction, I already went through this quite extensively with my guys in class, but I'll go through it again because I doubt they'll remember this. To be honest, it's quite complex. Okay, so sexual reproduction. Why did I plural that? Sexual reproduction. So this, how does it create variation? This does it in two folds. The first thing first is meiosis. After meiosis is a process of producing. This is a cell division. This is a cell division that produces. Oops, can't spell. That that produces gametes. If you don't know what gametes are, they're 6 cells. Okay, now with meiosis, the gametes are all unique. Okay, so they're all unique from each other, and they're all unique from the parent cells, and they only have half the number of the chromosomes. The number of chromosomes compared to the parent cell, because they split twice. So they're all unique, and they have half the number of chromosomes. Why half? Because you need 2 parents to fertilize, so you get half from each parent, and then boom, you have a full set. Okay, now why are they unique? How are they unique? Because of the process of crossing over and independent assortment. Independent assortment. Now these are more level 2 ideas, but they just mention it, and if you go through some of the past year exams, you're going to see some detailed answers on them. It's not really emphasized because you're only level 1s, but that's one of the first things about where variation comes about in the second part, which is sexual reproduction, is that during meiosis you produce sex cells which are completely unique from each other, because when they line up to be divided, how they line up and how they get assorted is like which one ends up going to which particular gametes is completely random, has no interference with the previous events or the events afterwards. It's like when it says independent, what it means is like, oh, if you see a couple, the first child is a boy, what's the chance of the second child being a girl? So, and then you'll be like, oh, it doesn't matter, the first child has no influence on the second child. Doesn't mean it's 50-50, the first one's a boy, the second one must be a girl. So what that means is that the chance of them being born the girls is independent from each other. There's no relationship between them. Every single fertilization is random. Okay, so they're not, doesn't guarantee. It's like heads, if you toss a coin, it doesn't mean heads, next one will be tail. Same example here. So how they are arranged is independent, and as they line up, you can have a look at some meiosis diagrams online. When they line up in the equator, in the middle, when they get pulled apart, because remember these things are chemicals, they are going to get tangled up and they will swap bits and pieces of information, and when they do that, they create a unique chromosome. The chromosome will function perfectly normal, and because it has all the pieces it needs, they just swapped a bit. Like say for example, if you're wearing a jumper, your brother or sister is wearing a hoodie, like, and then you're like, all right, I like yours, you like mine, swap, and you're still warm, you still have the clothes on, and you're still covered, and it does exactly the same function. You just swapped it, and you still both work. Okay, so that's what crossing over means. But the main idea is that these gametes are all unique from each other. Okay, so I just realized that my gametes is spelled incorrectly here. Games, too many games during lockdown. But gametes they're all unique, and they have half the number of chromosomes compared to the parent cell. Okay, the second part. All right, so we talked about the gametes are all unique, and then the second part is fertilization. Okay, so we produced unique gametes, and during fertilization, which gamete ends up in fertilization is completely random. Okay, so, and then again has no future or has no relationship between each individual. Each fertilization is an individual event. So what it means is like, think about a male produces hundreds of millions or billions of sperms, very frequently. All of these little guys are going to be unique. They all carry similar but different chromosomes. Now, which one of these guys will get to fertilize an egg is completely random. Okay, so think about the possibility is that the gametes are all random, they're all unique, and which one of them gets end up in the fertilization process is completely random. So it means that every single child, the single identical twins are a little bit different, but for the vast majority of the population, is that you will look similar to both of your parents or your siblings, but you will be different because of this process of meiosis, the process of fertilization, everything being random. You create unique gametes. They will create variations in the population. You will be very alike, but you are not exactly the same. So these are the two things that you need to remember. What creates variation? Mutation. Due to changing the base sequence, you make a new allele, and you just end up being different compared to everyone else, and that could be beneficial or that could be harmful. Number two is through sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction, because of meiosis, you create unique gametes. Then these unique gametes, which one of these guys get to fertilize with another gamete, which is again completely unique, is random. And then you create what we call a unique offspring. Okay, so it's gonna have a bit of both each parent, but it's gonna be unique. Even the siblings, you're similar, but you are unique. You're all different to one another. Okay, so why is it good? Why is sexual reproduction good? Why is mutation good? Why is having genetic variation a good thing in the long run? Let's think about it. Because sexual reproduction is actually the one that one thing we talk about in junior science is that if you compare sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction, sexual reproduction takes more time, it takes more energy. You need to find a partner. You need to do courtship, like have to attract a partner. You have to fight for them, blah blah blah. It's quite time consuming. Why do we do this? So what are the advantages? What are the advantages of variation? Now, the most common example, and I'll be very, very surprised if they don't ask this in the exam. But why is variation good? Well, if you think about, especially in New Zealand, we have a lot of horticultural and kiwi fruits export and things like that. If you, or sheep or cows, any agricultural industry that involves growing or breeding things, it's good to have variation. It's for the farmers. It's probably, if you planting kiwi fruits, you probably only want to plant this particular type of kiwi fruit that that's going to give you lots of fruits, so you make more money. You actually don't want too much variation in your plantation, because that will create, you don't want you don't want the kiwi fruit to do whatever they want and end up being, some of them being small, some being sour, some being golden, some being green. You don't want that to happen. So that's why New Zealand have a very strict the quarantine process. You can think about it like the import and export. I remember Auckland or some other areas in New Zealand being shut down, like the streets were being quarantined by the Ministry of Primary Industry, I think it is. I can't remember which one. One of the bureaucrats, is that they shut down the streets and they go in the street because they found a fruit fly. And you may go, what does that fruit fly do to our kiwi fruit? Because that fruit fly is going to bring a genetic a disease, or cause or potential disease. If that thing gets into one of the plantations of a kiwi fruit, and that's going to spread them out, in the plantations of the kiwi fruits are probably not going to be great in terms of variation. They're going to be very similar, because we want to grow the best ones. We want to quality control, so we don't want variation in those places. So if one of those fruit flies gets in, it's going to spread the disease. It's going to wipe all of them out. Because if it kills one, it's going to kill all of them, because they're genetically identical. It's like watching TV shows. How many, say for example, I grew up, showing my age, I grew up playing or watching other people playing Resident Evil games. If you watch The Walking Dead, anything with zombies, apocalypse movies, you'd be like, some people get infected, some people don't. Why is that? Because there is variation. Some people are immune to certain viruses or diseases, and just by chance they can survive things, and they can live on, continue to populate, continue the species, and and then we have great TV shows and movies like that to showcase that. But the main idea of variation is that if the environment changes, so if the environment changes, this is probably the main one. If the environment changes, now please just stick to disease. Disease is the best example, genetic disease, okay? Or you can talk about drought, like say if you're looking at, that's D-R-A-U-G-H-T if you can't read, like say disease, drought, or introducing of new predators, or blah, 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 like less water, more water, flooding. When there's an environment change, some of the species, some individual, some of the population will survive. Some of the population will have favorable trait to survive and will survive. Oops, can't spell. Survive and pass on the gene, and pass on the favorable trait. So that just means it won't get completely wiped out, like I mentioned about the kiwi fruit. Because if everything is the same genetically, and if there was a disease that's going around, and if that catches one of them, and that if that's like a infectious disease, it's going to wipe all of them out because they're all genetically identical. But if we have like I say, a disease which we currently have around the world, a pandemic, if we have one of those going around, some population, if we don't do anything about it, then that's very, very bad. But if we relate to the zombie apocalypse movies and things like that, some of the population will just be naturally immune. Like say, for example, if you, again, because I'm a gamer, like think about The Last of Us, if the natural immunity of the main character allows her to be alive even though being bitten by a zombie. So so some of the population will have favorable trait, and these individuals will survive, they will reproduce, they will pass on their genes, so all the future generations will have the same favorable trait, hopefully, because of you saw the Punnett square, sometimes they don't, but then they will continue the species and they won't die out. And that is the number one thing of having genetic variation. That is the trouble of all of the especially the living things that undergo sexual reproduction. All of the trouble, all of the hassle to go through all of that is to reproduce, so that as a species there will be something that will end up surviving. Okay, so that's the main idea. Let's say, for example, environment change. Another good example I can think of, like think about the Industrial Revolution. Like think about the UK in the when was the Industrial Revolution? 1700s, 1800s? I can't quite remember. But there were the monarch moth or the monarch butterflies. I can't remember which species it was. So in the natural world, there was some white moth, and there was some dark colored moth, like grayish kind of moth. So and before the Industrial Revolution, nothing happens. The population of those two kind of colored moth are exactly the same, 50-50, for example. But then because of the Industrial Revolution, the burning of coal releases a lot of soot to the environment. So all the tree trunks and things tend to get covered with soot. So the environment has changed. So the white color ones or the light color ones, they stand out because due to their existing color. And whereas the gray color ones, just by chance, they didn't choose to be gray, just by chance, they would blend in the new environment because the human changed the environment. And then slowly over time, the light ones or the white ones get picked off by birds and other predators, and then all the gray ones survived. So that's a really good example of that. You have variations within the species that probably don't do anything at the stage, but will have an impact if the environment changes. Okay, so this is something that you just need to understand. All right, now just before we wrap up this video, just remember, for this particular topic, we need to do, again, for my classes, I'm going to send you a list of the vocabularies you need to know. So one of the key things you need to talk about is, you need to understand is, what is DNA, gene, allele, even chromosome's not even that important. Genotype, phenotype, and then you got from the genotypes you got the homozygous dominant, and then the homozygous dominant, heterozygous, just some terminologies. Homozygous recessive, like, do you know what these words mean? And then mutation, just terminologies that you need to be very, very familiar with. And then what are some of the questions are you gonna get? What is the relationship between gene, DNA, allele? That's like a typical merit question. Chuck mutation in there. That's an excellent question. You need to be able to understand test cross. What is test cross? How do you draw Punnett squares? Refer to my previous videos if you need help with these. Pedigree charts, again, refer to my previous videos for these concepts. And then look at meiosis, fertilization, gender determination. Gender determination kind of fit on Punnett square. Gender determination, and the big one is going to be variation. Okay, so this is most likely the big concepts you definitely need to know. And then sometimes they give you questions like, say, for example, a science teacher has lost his hearing due to his class being too loud. This is actually one of the school exams that we've had, or is an NCEA exam, I can't remember. I'm pretty sure it was a school exam we did a few years ago. Like, say this ability lost his hearing because his science class is too loud, always talking, he lost his hearing. What is the chance that his children are going to lose their hearing as well? I mean, it seems dumb, right? But then you have to explain it. You have to go, well, because it's not genetic, it's not happening, it's a physical trait, it's a change to his to this individual only. It's not happening in his gametes. It's not it's not a mutation. It's not going to be passed down to. You have to use the correct terminologies. Okay, so I mean, I personally quite like genetics because it's quite, with the pedigree charts, it's like just doing puzzles, and then variation. It just makes sense. Okay, so if you enjoy this topic, I do strongly recommend you to take level 2 biology because I double major in biology and chemistry, and I can say that at university I enjoy biology a little bit more because it was just easier. It just makes sense, and it was quite enjoyable. You get to do dissections and field trips and things like that, so it's quite a fun time. Okay, so there you go. Hopefully you enjoyed this particular video. Like and subscribe if you haven't done so already, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.